baby. Get a beer for the house. One beer. Woo!
Can't tell what no motherfucker is down here. No, because you motherfuckers look white and be black.
Come here. When is Rich do the gun again? Hey, Tony, come here. Stick up.
I was raised in a whorehouse. My grandmother ran it. My mother was a prostitute. My first toy was a used condom. The voice is calm, almost casual, as if describing a Sunday afternoon. But the words cut like shattered glass. This is the opening of Richard Pryor's 1979 show, when he decided there would be no more masks, no more safe smiles, no more comedy that didn't bleed. And the audience, expecting to laugh, fell silent. 3 seconds. 5. Then the explosion. Laughter, tears, collective catharsis. Because Richard Pryor had just done something no one had done before. He transformed America's deepest pain into a mirror and forced everyone to look. And the truth is more shocking than you imagined. Peoria, Illinois, 1940, a city where railroad tracks divided the world in two. On one side, post-war America, bright and promised. On the other, North Washington Street, where women in tight dresses smoked on corners and men drank whiskey since noon. It was there, in an establishment that officially sold drinks but unofficially sold anything, that Richard Franklin Lennox Thomas Pryor took his first steps. His grandmother, Marie Carter, ran the business with an iron fist. His mother, Gertrude, worked for her. His father, Leroy Buck Pryor, was a boxer who drank more than he fought. At 6 years old, Richard could already identify the smell of cheap perfume mixed with bourbon and the sound of moans coming through thin walls. At 8, he had seen things most children would never see in an entire lifetime. And at 10, when his mother abandoned him for good, he understood the first great lesson that would shape all his art. No one was coming to save him. So he learned to save himself, with jokes, with voices, with the almost supernatural ability to transform humiliation into humor, to make people laugh before they could laugh at him. But there was something few people know. Richard Pryor was sexually abused at 6 years old by a teenager from the neighborhood. It would take him decades to talk about it, and when he finally did, in an obscure 1999 interview, his voice trembled. "That broke me in a way I never fully repaired," he said. This trauma, hidden under layers of comic genius, would fuel both his rage and his compassion for the rest of his life. The 1960s arrived, and Richard Pryor was determined to escape Peoria. He served in the army for 2 years, where he was discharged for striking a white soldier who insisted on watching him like a zoo animal during a film showing black people being lynched. After the dishonorable discharge, he moved to New York and started doing stand-up in village clubs. But there was a problem. He wasn't being himself. Richard Pryor, in 1963, was a carbon copy of Bill Cosby. Impeccable suit, polished language, jokes about relationships and daily life that could be told on family television programs. And it worked. He got appearances on The Ed Sullivan Show, The Tonight Show. Doors were opening. Money started coming in. But something was dying inside him. In September 1967, at the Aladdin Hotel in Las Vegas, in the middle of a perfectly timed set, Richard Pryor stopped. Simply stopped. He looked at the audience of smiling white people waiting for his safe jokes and said, "What the fuck am I doing here?" He walked off stage, abandoned the contract, lost thousands of dollars, and disappeared. What nobody knew, what would only come to light decades later through interviews with close friends, is that Richard had gone to the hotel bathroom that night and stared at the mirror for 20 minutes. He cried. He punched the wall until his fingers bled. Because he had seen his future, being a tamed black man, making white people laugh without ever disturbing them, without ever telling the truth, without ever being free. And that was worse than death. It was invisibility. He fled to Berkeley, California, 1968. The city was on fire with protests, civil rights movements, Black Panthers, and a counterculture that promised to reinvent America. Richard dove in headfirst. He spent nights with Huey Newton, talked with Angela Davis, smoked marijuana with radical poets, and began remaking his comedy from scratch. No more clean jokes. Now it was naked truth. Racism, police violence, sex, drugs, American hypocrisy exposed with language that made people recoil in their seats. But something deeper was happening. Richard began incorporating characters, giving voice to the invisible. The addict on the corner, the con artist preacher, the decadent boxer, the baby still in the womb. He wasn't just doing comedy. He was channeling souls. And this came from a dark place. His closest friends say Richard had psychotic episodes, paranoid crises where he believed the CIA was monitoring his calls. Nights where he drank until he passed out and woke up not remembering what he had done. There was a latent violence in him, a rage he directed into art, but that sometimes overflowed. In 1972, at a Hollywood party, he struck a producer who made a racist joke. He was arrested, but instead of destroying his career, it consolidated him. Hollywood understood. Richard Pryor was dangerous, and the audience loved exactly that. The 1970s were the peak. 4 consecutive comedy albums, Emmy and Grammy Awards, films with Gene Wilder that broke racial barriers and made millions. Richard Pryor became the richest and most influential comedian in the world. But the price was being collected. He married and divorced multiple times, had explosive extramarital affairs, spent fortunes on cocaine. Close friends like Paul Mooney, his longtime writer, say there were days when Richard would snort an entire gram in a single session. And then came the guilt, the shame, the self-hatred. He began sabotaging his own career, showed up late to film sets, got into violent arguments with directors. On one occasion, he threatened to kill Chevy Chase during the filming of a movie. It was the beginning of the end, and then came the night that changed everything. June 9th, 1980. Richard was at his home in Northridge, California, smoking freebase cocaine. His wife at the time, Jennifer Lee, had just left after a violent fight. He was alone, paranoid, immersed in demons he could no longer control. At some point in the early morning hours, Richard poured cognac on himself and lit a lighter. Himself. It wasn't an accident. It was a suicide attempt disguised as drug-induced madness. Richard Pryor ran down the street in flames, banging on doors, screaming for help. A neighbor threw a blanket over him. Paramedics arrived and saw the skin of his body peeling off in strips. 50% of his body burned. 6 weeks in the hospital. Reconstructive surgeries. Unimaginable pain. And when journalists asked what had happened, he said it was an accident. But in his comeback show months later, he told the truth. I was trying to commit suicide, but I was too much of a coward to do it right. The following years were a mixture of resurrections and falls. Richard continued making films, shows, TV specials, but something had broken irreversibly. In 1986, at 45 years old, he was diagnosed with multiple sclerosis, the disease that would slowly erase his ability to move, to speak, to be Richard Pryor. But before the disease silenced him completely, he made his last great act of artistic courage. In 1992, he released a TV special where he spoke openly about his childhood in the brothel, about the sexual abuse, about the suicide attempts, about the loneliness that no amount of fame could cure. And for the first time, there was no laughter. It was just the truth, pure, bloody, painful. Critics didn't know how to react. The audience felt uncomfortable, but for Richard, it was liberation. He had spent his entire life making people laugh at his pain. Now, he wanted them to feel it. But there's a story few people know. A story that only came to light through an independent documentary made years after his death. During the 1970s, at the height of his fame, Richard Pryor secretly paid for the college education of 17 young black people from Peoria. Children of prostitutes, addicts, ex-convicts. He never revealed this publicly, never used it for public relations. He simply sent checks through a lawyer with a note that said, "You deserve a chance I never had. Don't waste it." Some of these young people became lawyers, doctors, teachers. One of them, interviewed in the documentary, cries as he tells, "Richard Pryor saved my life, and I didn't even know who he was until my mother told me years later." This side of Richard, the man who transformed his pain into anonymous compassion, was deliberately hidden by him. Because Richard didn't believe that kindness healed trauma. He believed that only expressing it, bleeding publicly, could give meaning to suffering. And then, in the last years of his life, confined to a wheelchair, unable to speak more than a few slurred words, Richard Pryor received visits from comedians he had influenced. Chris Rock, Dave Chappelle, Eddie Murphy. They all sat beside him, held his trembling hand, and told him how he had changed their lives, how he had opened doors that were locked, how he had proven that a black man could tell the truth without apologizing and still be loved. Richard listened, tears streaming down his immobile face, and nodded. He didn't need words. The validation he had sought his entire life, the love he had looked for in women, drugs, applause, was there, in those young and grateful faces. He had mattered. His pain had not been in vain. In December 2005, at 65 years old, Richard Pryor died of a heart attack. But his last word, whispered to his wife Jennifer days before, was, "Free, finally free." Richard Pryor's legacy cannot be measured in awards, films, or albums sold. He redefined what comedy could be. Before him, stand-up was entertainment. After him, it became confessional art, public therapy, cultural revolution. He proved you could talk about race without softening, about addiction without romanticizing, about trauma without asking for pity. He showed that vulnerability wasn't weakness, but the most radical form of strength. And he did this paying the highest price an artist can pay, sacrificing his own mental stability, his health, his relationships, everything in the name of truth. But there was another legacy, less visible. Richard Pryor changed the way America talked to itself. In the 1970s and 80s, at a time when racism was politely ignored or violently repressed, Richard brought it to center stage. He forced white audiences to laugh at their own complicity. He forced black audiences to confront their own contradictions, and in doing so, he created a space where honest dialogue, however painful, could happen. Comedians like George Carlin recognized this. "Richard taught me you don't need to please everyone," Carlin said in an interview. "You need to be truthful. And if the truth makes people uncomfortable, great. At least you provoked something real." Today, decades after his death, Richard Pryor's impact is everywhere. Every time a comedian takes the stage and talks about depression, addiction, family trauma, systemic racism, they're walking on a road Richard opened with his own bleeding hands. Every time a black actor refuses a stereotypical role and demands complexity, dignity, truth, they're echoing Richard's refusal to be tamed. And every time anyone, decides they're not going to hide their pain anymore, that they'll transform it into something that can heal others, they're following the example of a boy from Peoria who grew up in a brothel and decided his shame would become his greatest weapon. But there's a cruel irony in all this. Richard Pryor spent his entire life making people laugh at his pain, but he himself rarely laughed. Close friends say that, off-stage, Richard was quiet, melancholic, often somber, the genius that shone under the spotlights, dimmed in empty rooms. And maybe that's what makes his story even more powerful. He wasn't a hero. He wasn't a saint. He was a deeply flawed man, addicted, sometimes violent, other times petty, who used his art not to escape from himself, but to finally find himself. There's a rare video recorded in 1998, 3 years after his last public show, where Richard Pryor is sitting in his wheelchair in his backyard. The California sun hits his face. He's trying to speak, but the words come out slurred, almost incomprehensible. The camera is operated by his wife, Jennifer, and she asks, "Richard, do you have any regrets?" He takes almost a minute to respond, fighting against the disease that stole his voice. And then, with surprising clarity, he says, "I should have loved more." Pause. "But I didn't know how." Jennifer approaches, kisses his forehead, and Richard smiles. Not the wide, performative smile of the stages, but a small, genuine, vulnerable smile. The smile of a man who finally made peace with his internal wars. This moment, captured almost by chance, was never widely broadcast. It remained stored in the family's personal archives, but it represents something fundamental about Richard Pryor. In the end, after all the battles, all the self-inflicted pain imposed by the world, he found a kind of peace. Not the peace of having resolved everything, but the peace of accepting that some wounds never close, and that maybe, just maybe, that's okay. Richard Pryor's story isn't about redemption. It's not about overcoming in the traditional sense, where the hero defeats all demons and lives happily ever after. It's about something more complex, more human, more true. It's about a man who was broken from the beginning, who never had the chance to be whole, but who decided that his fragmentation would be his art, that his cracks would let the light through, and that by exposing his wounds, he would give permission to millions of other people to do the same. This is Richard Pryor's silent revolution. Not just that he made it acceptable to talk about pain, but that he made pain sacred, worthy, transformative. He proved you don't need to be healed to be powerful. You just need to be willing to tell the truth, even if that truth is ugly, even if it hurts, even if no one wants to hear it. And if that isn't courage, then the word has no meaning. There's one last revelation that needs to be told. In 2019, 14 years after his death, a letter was discovered in his manager's office. It was from Richard, handwritten in 1994, when multiple sclerosis had already advanced significantly. The handwriting is shaky, almost illegible in some parts, but the content is crystal clear. Richard wrote to himself, a kind of final confession he never intended to publish. He writes, "I spent my whole life thinking I needed to make people laugh to be loved. But the love I received was always for Richard Pryor, the comedian. Never for Richard, the scared boy who just wanted someone to say everything was going to be okay. Now that I can no longer make people laugh, now that I have nothing left to offer, I discover that the people who stayed, those who are still here, are the ones who truly love me. And that's more than I deserved, more than I ever thought I'd have. If there's anything after this, I hope to meet my 6-year-old self and tell him, you survived, and it was worth it." The letter ends with a single word, underlined 3 times. Thank you. And maybe that's Richard Pryor's final lesson. That comedy, deep down, was always about survival. That laughing isn't the opposite of crying, but rather the other side of the same coin. That vulnerability can be a weapon, but it can also be healing. And that in the end, when everything else falls apart, when fame disappears and the body fails, what remains is simply this: gratitude for having existed, for having felt, for having mattered. Richard Pryor taught us that it's possible to transform the worst of ourselves into something beautiful, that trauma can generate art, that pain can generate connection, and that a boy from a brothel in Peoria, Illinois, with no prospects, no protection, no hope, can become the voice of a generation, not despite his pain, but through it. And that truth, that uncomfortable and magnificent truth, is what makes Richard Pryor's story not just important, but essential. Because if he could transform his hell into light, then maybe all of us can. Maybe that's the promise he left us, not that life will be fair or easy, but that even in the deepest darkness, there's still a voice. And that voice, however broken it may be, can still sing.